Hello. The Warhammer world has changed and evolved a great deal over the years, taking many inspirations and influences, combining them and reworking them into something brand new. And one of the greatest examples of this is arguably the Dwarfs, a race of stout and indefatigable people who would fight for the forces of order against the goblins, the elves, and all forms of chaos. There's probably no single stronger influence on Warhammer Fantasy than the Lord of the Rings, and of course the dwarves of Middle-earth provided a strong foundation on which the dwarfs of Warhammer would be built. But like any great master craftsman, the writers of Warhammer found their own ways to introduce flourishes, signatures, and runes that would make their dwarves unique to the world of Warhammer. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're building Warhammer Armies, the Dwarfs. Building Warhammer Armies is my series where I attempt to trace the origins of some of the greatest factions in Warhammer, Warhammer 40,000, and the Age of Sigmar to find out how they originally were created and how they evolved and changed over time. This is an enormous undertaking, and I will guarantee you that I have missed some very important details or some favourite mentions and miniatures and models. I've done my best, but really, this is just the things that I found most interesting in my research as I looked at the origins of the dwarfs and how they have evolved. In the Warhammer Old World, the dwarves are a force of good, a nation of stoic and long-lived folk, hardy and stalwart as the very rocks from which they carve their mountain homes. Along the spine of the Old World, the mountain range at the world's edge, there are many dwarf fortresses and cities hewn from the solid rock, and testament to the astounding engineering prowess of this innovative people. Short-limbed and short-tempered, the dwarves are renowned for their great book of grudges, for they never forget a betrayal, but they are also renowned for living up to their oaths and promises and standing side by side to defend the old world. But has that always been the way of the Warhammer Dwarf? Well, no, not entirely, because they have changed a reasonable amount since their first appearance in Warhammer's first edition. But before we get to that, if you want to avoid going into the Book of Grudges yourself, don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. And if you would like to support this work that I do here, then consider checking out my Patreon via the link in the description below. J.R.R. Tolkien and his Middle-earth were a huge inspiration to most of the fantasy authors who would come after him, including many of the writers of Warhammer Fantasy. In fact, they learned a great deal from the famous Hobbitologist. So I think we should start just by looking a little bit at some of his influences and some of his work. I'm no Tolkien scholar, but I do know that, amongst other things, Tolkien was an Oxford professor who worked on translations of Old English epics like Beowulf and studied literature and language. Inspirations for many of his fantasy creations can be found in classic literature, and for the dwarves, he was particularly influenced by Norse myths and Germanic folklore, where these beings were often associated with metalwork and mining. Of course, they weren't necessarily short in stature, but many of their characteristics were the same. In Middle-earth, the language of the dwarves is known as Khazad-dûl, and later in Warhammer Fantasy's life it would be known as Khazad-lid, or has been suggested to me, Khazi-lid, as in a Khazi, the slang term for a privy and later a toilet, and a lid, the thing that goes on a privy or a toilet. So, Khazi-lid. I'm sure it is excruciating hearing me explain jokes, so let's move on to something far more interesting, to me at least, and that is the spelling of the term dwarfs. The English plural for dwarf is dwarfs, with an S, but Tolkien was keen to cast his dwarves as a contrast to his elves, so he took the VES from the latter and added it to the former. In Warhammer, they have taken the English spelling, which has given rise to some slightly odd-looking names here and there, like the recent release of the arcane journal Dwarfen Holds. But early on, there were occasional references that used the Tolkien spelling, such as in the creature lists of the first edition, or the Bloodbath at Orcs Drift campaign pack, or even Woofrup's first edition. Even with the eventual spelling change, it's perhaps no surprise that given the importance of The Lord of the Rings to the creation of Warhammer Fantasy, that the dwarves, the diminutive warriors of the mountain realms, would find themselves featured in that very first edition. Dwarves are short but stout humanoids who live in underground towns, often cut deep into the side of mountains. They hate goblins and orcs on account of the goblin wars fought long ago between these two races. Citadel dwarves are as tough a bunch of their kind you're likely to meet. Armed and armoured, bearded and determined, ready to stride across your battlefields in search of their foes. Available as C7 and 8. Early Citadel ranges were classified according to the C numbers. Now these would change a lot, and there would be chopping and changing, moving of ranges between C numbers over time until they settled down a little bit later on. The C6, C7 and C8 ranges all included dwarves, but they covered many different flavours. There were dwarf adventurers, warriors, thieves and assassins. There were many female dwarf models as well as clerics and sorcerers. Perhaps the biggest contingent though were the northern dwarves, alongside whom we'd see the first dwarf berserkers, described as dour Nordic dwarves of barbaric and savage appearance, long beards and short tempers. These northern dwarves borrowed some aspects of the source material that Tolkien had worked with as well. The northern or Norse dwarves would be a constant presence in the Warhammer world from here on out, even if only in the background at times. In the early days of Citadel, in the pre-slaughter days, when miniatures still had metal bases built in, there were a number of different franchise IP box sets released. These would cover things like Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion, Dungeons and Dragons, and, unsurprisingly, The Lord of the Rings. And there were a few that were just fun fantasy miniature sets, including a number that had dwarves in them as well. In 1982, Alan and Michael Perry sculpted the Dwarf King's Court, an almost chess-like set of dwarf royalty, hangers-on, guards, gnomish jesters, and a chained-up bear. As far as I know, there was little lore created for this group besides the names, but some of the names are worth mentioning, particularly the Queen's Champion, Quentin Limpfondle, and the Jester Gnome, Corbett Shortstuff. Brian Ansell's heroic adventurers would also include some dwarf characters alongside lawful knights, half-elves, and samurai. White Dwarf 45 featured the first official Warhammer scenario. Joe Deaver's Thistlewood included loyal dwarves standing alongside the loyal half-elves in an army of good King Ammius. And whilst the background and characters of this battle wouldn't become permanent additions to the Warhammer canon, the idea of dwarves loyal to the leaders of men, such as Imperial dwarves, would be something around for quite a long time. In White Dwarf 49, we'd see a little bit more about the dwarves, with an extract from the forthcoming book, Forces of Fantasy. There would be a short background section about the dwarves, and some dwarf magic, because back then, dwarves could still have wizards. This Forces of Fantasy extract in White Dwarf 49 also served to advertise some miniature bundles: the dwarf mines of Drongoria, the dwarfs of the Blue Mountain, and the dwarf settlers of the Western Trails. The Blue Mountain dwarves were another holdover from Tolkien, and we wouldn't hear about the mines of Drongoria ever again, although we would eventually see plenty of dwarf drongs. The background for the dwarves had begun to take a more familiar shape, and of course there had always been things like the long-lived nature of dwarves and their ill tempers, but with the release of more material, Regiments of Renown and other stuff in White Dwarf, we would start to see more character applied to this race in the Warhammer world. Dwarves are intensely proud and often very short-tempered. Dwarf history relates many occasions when dwarfish indignation at some petty slight resulted in racial feuding or costly war. One such occasion was when Wolf-Run Willowhand was slain in a drunken brawl with Grom the Paunch of the Misty Mountain, a goblin of especially ill repute. The resultant feud lasted for half a century and became known as the Goblin Wars. This was a bloody and costly affair which ended in the destruction of the remaining goblin armies at the Battle of Mad Dog Pass. The battle raged for 3 days and ended in total victory for the dwarves, led by Wolf-Run's surviving relatives Thorgrim Braindim and Dane Ironhead. Thorgrim Braindim was actually an early dwarf special character, detailed as the leader of the dwarf explorers in the first edition scenario Ziggurat of Doom, and his miniature was only available via mail order using a coupon found in the Warhammer boxed set. It doesn't seem like he stuck around too much longer than that, but correct me if you've spotted him elsewhere in dwarf history. Forces of Fantasy wouldn't be the only appearance for Dane Ironhead either, and I should note that Dane Ironhead is a easy-to-miss, subtle, very sneaky little reference to The Hobbit, where one of the dwarves is called Dane Ironfoot. In the Book of Battalions, a set of army lists written by a whole host of early Citadel staff, there was a list for the Dwarfs of Horrorwell, sent from Dane Ironhead, now a kingdom rather than an individual, and led by Thrain Hogfoot, the Warden of Horrorwell. With the release of the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy, the Warhammer world would start to become more consistent and coherent, and things like the dwarves would get some minor changes to start making them feel more Warhammery. There would be changes to the Forces of Fantasy entry, and in the Battle Bestiary for the second edition, we would find out more information about an increasingly important ancient enmity. One such war was fought in the legendary past, when the dwarves battled against the elves of the old world. Eventually the elves retired from the conflict, returning to their homelands in the elven kingdoms, whilst the weakened dwarfs fell victim to invasions of goblins. The background section would include more detail on distinct populations like the Norse dwarfs, and how, thanks to increasing incursions by chaos, they had found themselves fleeing to Lustria. There would also be more detail about the timeless hatred of goblins, the fact that the dwarf race was slowly dying out, and the occasional example of dwarves who had fallen to chaos themselves. Plus, there would be a small note about dwarfs and magic. They are very non-magical, and dwarf wizards are rare. You could still take dwarf wizards though, and there were full rules included, but the dwarven wizards and their clerics would soon fade from view, but we wouldn't yet see their runic replacements. The character of the Norse dwarfs was perhaps closer to the inspirations, the Old English texts that Tolkien had drawn from, than their dwarf mountain-hold cousins. But from that Norse dwarf population, there would come something that would become synonymous with Warhammer dwarfs as a whole, and it all started with a single berserker. The berserkers began with a single character, Yuggo Yorickson, and slowly morphed into the unforgettable dwarf slayers, doom-seeking, topless, bemohawked, axe-wielding psychopaths intent on glorious death in battle against the greatest of enemies. I actually did a full video just about the dwarf slayers, which you can watch via a link in the description, but in brief, by the time of the third edition, the Slayers had essentially replaced the Berserkers as the mad warriors of the dwarfs, and with stories like Gotrek and Felix and more detail on the nature of these unusual fellows included in the pages of WFRP, they were quickly embraced by fans and became a stalwart of the dwarf army. In the 6th edition of the game, there would even be full Slayer armies as part of the Storm of Chaos, a portent of the dyed orange dwarf armies that would one day take over for the Darwi. There would be another dwarf box set of miniatures arriving in 1985, the Dwarf Lords of Legends, and that featured the first official dwarf slayer, Kimril Giant Slayer, as well as other heroes like Borax Bloodaxe and Throbin Deatheye. And of course, John Blanche's box art for that set is a true classic. There would be many other dwarf appearances here and there throughout the first editions of Warhammer, not just slayers, but many different types of dwarfs, such as in the scenario box set The Tragedy of Macbeth, which followed a Shakespearean satire set beside the Scottish-inspired Locks of Albion. The arrival of the first ever Regiment of Renown, Bugman's Dwarf Rangers, came in 1984, and then later the Imperial Dwarves of Prince Ulthar would join them. In the Ravening Horde's Book of Army lists for the second edition, there was another early list for building forces of dwarfs in Warhammer. At this time, there are still entries for the wizards and for trebuchets, but there's also the Imperial Dwarfs, the Engineering Guild, organ guns, and flame cannons. The dwarf miniature range through this era would increasingly become more consistent, with things like the thieves and the magic users becoming less common. Though, at one point around this time, nearly the entire pre-Slaughter dwarf range was re-released, and it is a beautiful range to see. A whole host of different attitudes and characters, before that more uniform style fully took over. The dwarfs also had the distinction of becoming the first hard plastic miniatures produced for Warhammer, with 1985's Psychostyrene Dwarf Sprue. This was a technological innovation worthy of dwarfen engineering, and one which would become an essential ingredient in Citadel's incredible success story. 1987 marked a high point in Games Workshop history, and a true inflection point in the entire history of the hobby, because in the space of 1 year, they released Warhammer 40,000, Warhammer Fantasy Battles 3rd Edition, and Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Now, 40k would go on to eclipse everything, and it introduced dwarves of its own, space dwarves, the squats, but that is an entire other thing, a video unto itself, so I'll not talk about them anymore. But in WFRP and Warhammer Fantasy Battle 3rd Edition, we would see the modern dwarves of Warhammer really take root. In the pages of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, there would be playable dwarf characters like troll slayers, and more detail was provided on aspects of dwarf culture, like the worship of Grungni, the dwarven god of mining, and the development and subsequent decline of the dwarf civilization in the Old World. It's also fun to note that although it's not easy, it is possible to create dwarf wizard player characters, if you really want to cause some grudges. Games Workshop didn't just sell Citadel dwarfs during this period though, there were others as well, the Marauder dwarfs. Sculptors Ali Morrison and Trish Carden would form their own miniatures company with Brian Ansell, Marauder Miniatures, which would exclusively produce models for Games Workshop. Amongst the ranges were a great many dwarfs, clansmen, thunderers, slayers, war machines, and much more, though my particular favourites are these dandies of the Dwarf Warrior Regiment, very fancy clothes that fit right in with their Imperial allies. Sadly, the Marauder range would be subsumed into the regular Citadel offering in the early 90s, and the more Imperial of these dwarves would become a thing of the past. Another legendary dwarf sculptor at Games Workshop that must be mentioned is the great Colin Dixon. Having joined GW in the 80s as an illustrator, Dixon retrained as a sculptor and quickly became a fan favourite. There are many classic miniatures to his name, but for some, his most famous and enduring work was on the Dwarves of Warhammer. As well as sculpting a huge number of troops over the years, he also produced characterful models, like those for the Grudge of Drong campaign in the 5th edition, and the Dogs of War Long Drong's Slayer Pirates, as well as the wonderful series of Drunk Dwarfs. Within just a couple of years of the release of Warhammer Fantasy Battles 3rd Edition and WFRP's first, there would begin a story, a narrative, unlike any seen before or since in Games Workshop's storied history. This would be the saga of Gotrek and Felix. Created by William King as a reflection of his games of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the characters of Gotrek, a determined troll slayer with no fear, and his oath-bound companion, the human poet Felix, would premiere as the first story in the first ever book of fiction published by Games Workshop. They would go on to feature in more of the fiction anthologies and White Dwarf articles, with King even recreating the cover of WFRP in one of his stories. With the creation of the Black Library, the stories of Gotrek and Felix would continue, and through them, all readers would get to see a different, deeper, stoic, yet mournful, and regularly furious side to the Dwarfs of Warhammer. The 3rd edition supplement, Warhammer Armies, would introduce some of the great dwarf traditions for their warriors that would hold true until the end of time. Dwarf clansmen and slayers were joined by thunderers using gunpowder weapons, veteran warriors known as Longbeards, heavily armoured battle troops called Ironbreakers, and hard-hitting shock troops known as Hammerers. Interestingly enough, the list also included a very minor-looking dwarf who was actually called a sapper in this edition, as well as units of gnome warriors, shorter cousins of the dwarfs. With the release of Warhammer Fantasy Battles 4th edition in 1992, the Warhammer known world truly became known once and for all, because the people and the places and the particulars of most of the races would be set in relative stone. They would change from here on out with a couple of different tweaks and revisions, but more often than not that would be in tone rather than in detail. In the 4th edition box, The Battle Bestiary by Rick Priestley and Andy Chambers retold the tale of the dwarfs as an ancient race fallen into decline. Prideful, honourable, and deeply respectful of age, often exemplified by the growing of a magnificent beard — I, by the way, am a fan of that — These dwarves were also possessed of an unmatched ability to bear a grudge, even going so far as to record every possible slight in the Great Book of Grudges. To break faith is the worst possible kind of dishonour to a dwarf. A broken bond will be bitterly remembered, leading to determined acts of vengeance and vendettas which may last for centuries. Great breaches of faith against the dwarfs of a particular stronghold are recorded for posterity in a Great Book of Grudges, a huge tome carefully maintained by the stronghold's dwarf lord, and constantly updated. Nigel Stillman also wrote a very simple get-you-by army list for inclusion in the 4th edition starter box, but it would be his work in White Dwarf and the impending Warhammer Armies Dwarfs book that we would really test the mettle of these marvellous miners. And that's with an E, not with an O, because these are not beardlings, they're all like super, super old. White Dwarf 152 in August of 1992 offered up a preview of the new dwarf background, written by Stillman, who would also write the impending Warhammer Armies book alongside Rick Priestley. The article featured new historical details and a map of the Mountain Realms, with plenty of information about key locations important to the dwarves in the Old World. In the following issue, even more information will be provided by Stillman, this time talking about dwarf rune magic. As a race, dwarves lack the sensitivity needed to perceive the magical force. It does not flow through them, and they are unable to comprehend its subtle shades or feel its vibrations. Dwarfs have no wizards as such, and instead rely on a few rare individuals who are able to manipulate the magical force in special ways. These dwarfs are called runesmiths, an ancient guild of craftsmen who construct elaborate magical devices and weapons inscribed with secret runes. Rune weapons allowed for dwarf players to use an equivalent power to magical spells without having to actually cast anything during the battle, and they would become a permanent feature of the dwarf army. This would mark more or less the end of dwarves and traditional magic. Instead, they would lean further and further into the use of rune magic, a defining feature of the Warhammer Dwarf army. And it would be in the 1993 Warhammer Armies Dwarves book, written by Nigel Stillman and Rick Priestley, that all of those changes and everything that we'd learned through the evolution of dwarves in Warhammer over the last decade would be brought together in a consolidated, final, almost, Warhammer Dwarf army. The book explored the full pantheon of dwarf deities, provided expansive detail on the lost and remaining realms of the dwarves, and covered the history of the dwarf people in more detail than had been seen before. The underground explosives experts, the sappers, were reworked into the underground mining experts, the dwarf miners. There were also new special characters introduced, like Ungrim Ironfist, the Slayer King of Carrick Cadrin, and High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer, alongside updated entries for the likes of Joseph Bugman, the Master Brewer. There would eventually be a book that spent even more time looking at the culture and the civilization, the history and the people of the dwarves than this book, though, and that would be in 2002 when Hogshead released their own supplement about dwarfs for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Written by Alfred Nunez Jr., Dwarfs, Stone and Steel was designed to provide players and GMs with everything they could possibly want to run dwarf-centered adventures and to create more complex dwarf PCs. A few years later, great teller of dwarf tales Gav Thorpe would join Nick Kime in writing a dwarf background book for the Black Library, Grudge Lore, which offered up a dramatic extract of one of the great books of grudges. I've touched on here and there throughout this history on the magnificent war machines of the dwarves, but I just wanted to take a moment to dwell on a few of my favourites from across that glorious history. Although it took a little while for cannon, organ guns, flame cannons, and other engineering marvels to become a cornerstone of the dwarf army, once they had arrived, they became entrenched, with many iterations over the years. In 1984, a dwarf cannon diorama set was released, featuring the war machine and crew, as well as a vacuum-formed plastic packaging tray that could be cut out and flipped over to provide a scenic base. Fantastic stuff. With the 4th edition, dwarf weapons of war became a little more mobile, as the Anvil of Doom could roll into battle, ridden by a runesmith and arcing lightning at gobos, elves, and any other foes you'd like. Speaking of mobile dwarfs, the Juggernaut was an arcane monstrosity that ought to have been repeated in later editions. The massive metal kit was designed by Tony Ackland, and though it never received any official rules, I'm told it did make an appearance in the Black Library novel The Curse of the Phoenix Crown by C.L. Werner. In the naval battle game Man of War, the dwarf fleet was mainly comprised of steam-powered ironclads and dreadnoughts, though it also featured the Nautilus submarines to deliver death from below, and from above, the dwarf war balloons would rain destruction on enemy fleets, just as they would do in Dreadfleet and even over the battlefields of Warmaster. More advanced aerial superiority was available to the dwarfs of 8th edition though, with the Thunderbarge airship, which was featured in the core rulebook. Another such vessel had even appeared in the adventures of Gotrek and Felix, the Spirit of Grungni. But we are just beating around the clouds here, because I think we can all agree that there is one war machine that's more iconic than perhaps any other, and that is the dwarf gyrocopter. Sculpted by Mark Copperstone, a gyrocopter first flew into battle in Warhammer's 3rd edition, and an updated version by Michael Perry and Norman Swales would see service for many years. In the later editions of the game, a new gyrocopter eventually found its way into fine cast resin, and then a plastic gyrocopter and even a gyro bomber would be available for the final editions of the game. The dwarfs didn't stop seeing new editions, new characters, or units being released in the final editions of Warhammer Fantasy, but I feel like that Armies book that was released in 1993 really defined what the Warhammer Dwarf was. It set the tone for every Armies book to come, even if things might get more grimdark or more outrageous with certain editions. One of the great artists of Warhammer Dwarfs was David Gallagher, whose wonderful illustration had graced the cover of the 4th edition Armies book. For the 7th edition, the dwarfs would finally make it into a starter box, the Battle for Skull Pass, which would see them go up against their classic foes, the Night Goblins. The plastic dwarfs in this box had come a long way from their psychostyrene ancestors, and David Gallagher's concept art shows an incredible evolution to a more ornate and armoured fighting force. The dwarfs of Warhammer kept being refined and tweaked throughout the 6th, 7th and 8th editions of the game, but the character of the dwarf had well been established before that point. And sure, there would be wild and wonderful extra stuff like goblin hewers and iron drakes, and I think the DNA of Tolkien's dwarves would run through all of the Warhammer dwarf histories, but I think that in that 4th edition book, and all of the ones that came after it, we had achieved something that was uniquely Warhammer. This wasn't quite the Tolkien dwarf, this was the Warhammer dwarf. I've said it before, I'll no doubt say it again, and I'm going to repeat it here, and that's that I think that Warhammer's greatest strength, its greatest success, was always in taking all of these different inspirations and synthesizing them into something else, to become more than the sum of its parts. Through the humour and the creativity and the ingenuity of its writers, it could lean on different tropes and classic ideas and then mash them together in a way that would create something that was of the Warhammer world. And I think that the dwarves are a great example of this. You don't have to agree with me, but I think that they really are very Warhammer. And it's okay if you don't think that too, but know that you will be going in my book of grudges. I hope that you've enjoyed this relatively short exploration of the origins of Warhammer Dwarves and their history in the game up to a certain point. If you would like to see more of this kind of stuff, perhaps looking at the rest of Dwarven history through the other editions, the history of dwarf runes and magic and the holds and their language, the presence of female dwarves in the setting, or chaos dwarves, dwarf wizards, and how that did evolve in more detail, then let me know down in the description below. I would love to hear from you. If you would like to help me make more of this kind of video, perhaps some of those ones as well, then feel free to check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. You'll get access to my Discord, to updates about the work that I'm doing, exclusive and early access content, and I'm doing giveaways up to the end of this year every single month. So all of that is via the link in the description below. Everything you can do to help is greatly appreciated. Of course, if you can share this video, leave a comment, like, and subscribe to the channel here on YouTube, that is enormously helpful as well. and I greatly appreciate that too. In fact, why don't you leave a comment down below about your favourite dwarf from Games Workshop history, whether that's a character, whether that's a miniature. I would love to see it, and I'm sure everybody else would love to chat about what their favourite Dawi are as well. And don't forget that if you're buying hobby supplies, you can use my Element Games affiliate link to support the channel too. That's down in the description as well. Thank you once again for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. You don't want to be in this video? It's about dwarves. You love dwarves.